The first time Jacob Kane saw her, she was being sold, not in chains, not on an auction block, but sold all the same, standing in the dim corner of Brennan's saloon while men with whiskey breath and greedy eyes haggled over her worth like she was livestock. Sarah Coulter, 26 years old, widow, no children, no dowry, $300 in debt she didn't owe, attached to her name by a dead husband's brother who saw her as currency. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just stood there with her jaw set and her hands clenched at her sides, those gray eyes burning with something Jacob recognized instantly, the look of a cornered animal deciding whether to bite or run. Vic Brennan, the saloon keeper, leaned back in his chair, fat fingers drumming on the table. 2 weeks, Silas. Your brother's debt becomes her problem if you can't pay. And we both know how she'll be paying it. The men around the table laughed. Coarse, ugly sounds. Jacob's hand tightened on his whiskey glass. He'd come to Deadwood to sell furs, buy ammunition, and leave. He'd learned long ago not to get involved in other people's troubles. A man who cared too much ended up buried in the Black Hills dirt alongside his good intentions. But when Sarah's eyes swept across the room and locked with his for just a second, defiant, desperate, damned, something in his chest cracked open like spring ice. This was how good men became fools. This was how ghosts from the past reached out and pulled you back into the world of the living. Stay with me. You need to hear how this ends, because in Deadwood, nothing ever ends the way you think it will. Sarah Coulter had been in tight spots before. When her husband died in a mine collapse 2 years back, leaving her with nothing but his name and his debts, she'd learned fast that the world didn't forgive women for being unlucky. She'd taken work in Brennan's saloon, washing dishes, serving drinks, sweeping floors. Honest work, if barely respectable. But honest work didn't pay $300. Not in 2 weeks. Not in 2 years. The night after Brennan's ultimatum, she sat in the tiny room she rented above Emma Hartford's boarding house, staring at the cracked mirror on the wall. Her reflection looked tired, older than 26, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. A knock at the door made her jump. "Sarah, you got a visitor." Emma's voice, cautious. When she opened the door, Jacob Kane stood in the narrow hallway, hat in his hands. Up close, he was bigger than she'd realized, broad-shouldered, weathered, with the kind of stillness that made you nervous because you couldn't predict what he'd do next. His beard was dark, shot through with gray. His eyes were blue, pale as winter sky, and when they looked at her, they didn't rake over her body the way most men's did. They met her gaze and held it. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, roughened by wind and silence. "I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing." Sarah crossed her arms. "If Brennan sent you." "He didn't." They stared at each other. Finally, Sarah stepped back, letting him in. Emma lingered in the doorway for a moment, protective, worried, but Sarah nodded, and the older woman reluctantly left. Jacob stood in the center of the small room, looking too large for the space. He got straight to it. "I need someone to cook and mend for the winter. I've got a cabin 15 miles into the Black Hills. Good shelter, but isolated. I'd pay your debt to Brennan, all 300, and you'd work for me for 1 year to settle it." Sarah's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "And what else would I be working off?" His jaw tightened. "Food, shelter, nothing else. You'd have your own room." "I'm not looking for a wife, Mrs. Coulter. I'm looking for someone who can boil coffee without burning it, and sew a torn shirt without complaining about the blood." "Why me?" "Because you need out of Deadwood. And I need help I can trust not to rob me blind or slit my throat in my sleep." He paused. "And because I saw your face tonight." You're not the kind of woman who'll let Brennan break you. That's worth something. Sarah studied him. She'd gotten good at reading men, the ones who lied, the ones who wanted, the ones who took. Jacob Kane was different. Dangerous, maybe, but not in the way she was used to. I sleep alone, she said finally. That's non-negotiable. Agreed. And if I decide to leave after a year, you don't stop me. Wouldn't dream of it. She took a breath. Then we have a deal, Mr. Kane. The next morning, Jacob paid Brennan in cash, crisp bills laid out on the saloon table, while Sarah watched from the stairs. Brennan counted it twice, his piggy eyes flicking between them. You're making a mistake, Kane, he said, grinning. Woman like that's more trouble than she's worth. Jacob's expression didn't change. That's my problem now, isn't it? When they rode out of Deadwood 2 hours later, Sarah sat astride a stubborn pack mule, gripping the saddle with white-knuckled hands. She'd never been 15 miles from town in her life. Never been anywhere that didn't smell like smoke and sweat and desperation. The trail wound up into the hills, narrow and rocky. Jacob rode ahead on a gray gelding, his rifle slung across his back. He didn't talk, didn't look back to see if she was keeping up. Just kept riding, steady as a clock. By midday, they stopped at a stream. Jacob knelt, filled a tin cup, and handed it to her without a word. She drank, the water so cold, it hurt her teeth. Only after she'd finished did he drink himself. That small gesture, waiting, giving her first, stayed with her. When night fell, they made camp in a clearing. Jacob built a fire, cooked beans and salt pork in a blackened pan. He served her first, then took his own portion and sat on the opposite side of the flames. The firelight carved shadows into his face, turning him into something ancient and unknowable. Why do you live all the way out here? Sarah asked finally, unable to bear the silence. Jacob chewed slowly, then swallowed. Used to live in a town, had a house near the river, a wife, a daughter. His voice was flat, like he was reciting facts about a stranger. Rode off to fight the Sioux. When I came back, they'd been dead 6 months. Cholera. Neighbors buried them while I was gone. Sarah's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Don't be. Just the way things go. He poked at the fire with a stick. Mountains are quieter. Easier. She wanted to say something, that she understood, that she too knew what it was to lose everything. But the words stuck. Instead, she watched him across the flames and wondered what kind of man chose solitude over the chance of being hurt again. Before she lay down to sleep, Jacob stood and carried his bedroll to the edge of the clearing, far from the fire. You'll be warmer closer in, Sarah said. You'll be safer with space between us, he replied. And for the first time in 2 years, Sarah Coulter fell asleep without fear. The cabin was small, but solid. 2 rooms separated by a rough-hewn door, a stone fireplace that held heat well, and a roof that didn't leak. Jacob's room was little more than a cot and a trunk. He gave Sarah the larger room without discussion, as if it had always been meant for her. The first month was defined by silence and routine. Sarah cooked, mended, kept the fire going. Jacob hunted, chopped wood, repaired what needed fixing. They spoke only about practical things, how much flour was left, whether the roof needed patching before the first snow, if the mule was limping. But silence could be loud in its own way. Sarah noticed things. The way Jacob cleaned his rifle, with the same careful attention most men reserved for lovers. How he always washed his hands before meals, a habit from some other life. The scar that ran along his left forearm, white and puckered, that he never explained. And he noticed her. She felt it in the way his gaze would linger half a second too long when she stretched to hang laundry, The careful distance he maintained, never coming too close, never letting their hands touch when he passed her something. One night, a month in, Sarah woke to her own screaming. The dream had been vivid. Brennan's hands on her, his breath hot and sour, the sound of men laughing, and when she jolted awake, gasping, she found Jacob standing in her doorway, rifle in hand, eyes wild. "What happened?" His voice was sharp with alarm. "Nothing. Just—" She pressed her hands to her face, shaking. "Just a dream." He lowered the rifle slowly. For a moment he just stood there, and she could see him wrestling with something. The urge to comfort, the fear of crossing a line. Finally, he disappeared and returned with a tin cup of water. He set it on the small table beside her bed and backed away. "Bad dreams don't mean you're weak," he said quietly. "They mean you survived something worth dreaming about." Sarah looked up at him. This man who'd bought her freedom with $300 and asked for nothing but coffee and clean shirts. "Why did you really help me, Jacob?" His jaw worked. "Because 5 years ago, I wasn't there when I should have been. And I can't fix that. But maybe—" He trailed off, then shook his head. "Get some sleep, Sarah." After he left, she lay awake for a long time. The taste of cold water on her tongue, and the echo of his words in her chest. The snow came early that year, heavy and relentless. By mid-November they were snowed in, the world beyond the cabin reduced to white silence. Days blurred together. Wake, eat, work, sleep. But the isolation did something strange. It stripped away pretense, left no room for lies. They began to talk. Sarah told him about her husband. A good man, she said, but a dreamer who'd bet everything on fool's gold and lost. "He died thinking he'd failed me," she said one night, staring into the fire. "Maybe he did, but I failed him too. I was so angry at him for leaving me with nothing that I never told him. I never told him I understood." Jacob was quiet for a long time. Then, "My wife's name was Lily. She used to sing while she cooked. Drove me crazy, all that noise. After she died, I'd have given anything to hear it again." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't even remember what her voice sounded like anymore." Sarah reached across the space between them and rested her hand on his. Just for a moment. Just long enough to say, "I see you. I know." He didn't pull away. The tension between them grew like spring thaw, slow, inevitable, dangerous. Sarah started to notice the way Jacob's shirt pulled tight across his shoulders when he split wood, the strength in his hands, scarred and capable, the way he moved through the world with a kind of unconscious grace, like a wolf that had forgotten it was meant to be wild. And Jacob noticed her. God help him, he noticed everything. The curve of her neck when she bent over the wash basin. The way she hummed softly sometimes when she thought he wasn't listening. The fact that her gray eyes could be soft as fog or hard as stone, depending on her mood. One afternoon, Sarah went to fetch water from the stream and saw him bathing, waist deep in the freezing current, water sluicing over skin, marked with scars from a dozen old battles. His back was a map of violence survived. She should have looked away. She didn't. When he turned and saw her standing there, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled like lightning before a storm. "Sarah." She fled back to the cabin, heart hammering, face hot. That night they sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence between them charged with everything they weren't saying. Jacob's gaze kept drifting to her, the firelight catching the auburn in her hair, the way her lips parted slightly when she was thinking. She caught him looking, held his gaze, didn't flinch. "Jacob," she said softly, "I don't want to be afraid anymore." He stood abruptly, fists clenched. "You should be. Not of me. Of this. of what happens when we—" He stopped, breathing hard. "You still owe me 7 months. I won't take advantage of that." "What if I'm offering?" "Then you're not thinking clearly." His voice was ragged. "When your debt's paid, if you still want, if you still feel, then we'll talk. But not before. You deserve a choice that's really yours." He walked out into the snow, leaving her alone with the fire and the ache in her chest. The blizzard hit in late December, vicious and sudden. Jacob had been checking his trap line when the sky turned black. He didn't make it back that night. Sarah stayed awake until dawn, pacing, stoking the fire, listening to the wind howl like something alive and hungry. When the sun finally rose, and he still hadn't returned, she pulled on every piece of warm clothing she owned and went looking. She found him a quarter-mile from the cabin, half buried in a snowdrift, hypothermic and barely conscious. It took everything she had to drag him back, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning with cold. Inside, she stripped off his frozen clothes with shaking hands, wrapped him in every blanket they had, built up the fire until the cabin was almost too hot. She lay beside him, giving him her warmth, and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. When he finally opened his eyes hours later, he found her curled against him, tears streaking her face. "Sarah," he rasped. She kissed him then, desperate, graceless, full of all the fear and relief and longing she'd been holding back. He groaned into her mouth, his hands coming up to cradle her face like she was something precious and breakable. "We shouldn't," he managed. "I don't care. Your debt? To hell with my debt, Jacob Kane. I'm not staying here because I owe you. I'm staying because I—" The words caught in her throat. "Because when I thought I'd lost you, I realized I can't remember what my life was like before you. I don't want to remember." He pulled her closer, his forehead pressed to hers. "If we do this, then we do it," she whispered. "No bargains, no debts, just us." They made love slowly, carefully, like two people learning a language they'd forgotten. His hands mapped the landscape of her body, the curve of her waist, the softness of her thighs, the places that made her gasp and arch against him. She learned the terrain of his scars, kissed each one like an apology for all the pain he'd carried alone. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the fire crackling softly, and Jacob traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "I'm still afraid," he admitted, "of losing you, of not being enough." "Me too," Sarah said, "but I'm more afraid of never trying." Outside, the storm raged. Inside, they held each other and let the world shrink down to the space between two beating hearts. But the world, as always, had other plans. It was February when the riders came. 3 of them, moving slow through the snow. Sarah saw them first from the window and felt her stomach drop. Silas, her brother-in-law, and 2 men she didn't recognize, rough-looking types with guns on their hips. Jacob was outside chopping wood. Sarah ran to him, and the look on her face told him everything. By the time Silas and his men reached the cabin, Jacob was waiting on the porch, rifle cradled in his arms. "Kane," Silas called out, staying mounted. "I'm here for my sister-in-law." "She's not going anywhere." "That's not your call to make." Silas spat into the snow. "She's family, blood, and Brennan's offering me a way out of my debt. A miner up in Helena wants a wife, sight unseen. 10 head of cattle for the right woman. Sarah's going to make me whole." "Over my dead body," Jacob said quietly. One of the men with Silas laughed. "That can be arranged, old man." The door creaked open behind Jacob. Sarah stepped out, her chin raised. "I'm not going with you, Silas." "The hell you're not." "I'm not your property. I never was. My husband's debts died with him. I checked the territorial law. You lied to Brennan, and you lied to me. Silas's face twisted. You ungrateful... I'm grateful, Sarah cut him off. Grateful I got away from men like you. Men who see women as livestock to be traded. I'd rather freeze to death in these mountains than spend one more minute under your roof. The words hung in the frozen air. Jacob moved slightly, putting himself between Sarah and the men. Silas glared at her, then at Jacob. Brennan's not going to let this go. Then Brennan can come talk to me himself, Jacob said, but he'll get the same answer you're getting. Now get off my land. For a tense moment, it could have gone either way. Then one of Silas's men shifted nervously, eyeing Jacob's rifle, and muttered, "This ain't worth it." Silas cursed, yanked his horse around, and rode off. The others followed. Sarah's legs almost gave out. Jacob caught her, held her steady. "It's not over," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "It's not." They rode back to Deadwood in early March, when the snow had melted enough to make the trail passable. Sarah insisted. She wouldn't run, wouldn't hide, wouldn't let Brennan hold her future hostage. Jacob tried to argue, but she was immovable. "If I don't face this now, it'll follow me forever." So they went together. Deadwood looked the same. Muddy, chaotic, violent. But Sarah wasn't the same woman who'd left. She walked into Brennan's saloon with her head high, Jacob a silent shadow at her side. The room went quiet. Brennan looked up from his table, surprise flickering across his face, before settling into a cold smile. "Well, well, the widow returns. Thought you'd run off to play house with your mountain man." Sarah stepped forward, ignoring the jeers. "Silas Coulter owes you money." "I don't. Under territorial law, a widow doesn't inherit her husband's brother's debts. I checked with the magistrate in Hill City." "This is Deadwood, darling. We don't care much for magistrates here." "Maybe not." Sarah's voice carried across the room. "But you care about money and reputation. So here's what's going to happen. Mr. Kane is going to pay Silas's debt. $300. That squares everything. And if you ever come after me again, I'll make sure every woman in this town knows exactly how you do business. I'll stand on every street corner and tell them how Vic Brennan threatens widows to work his upstairs rooms." Brennan's smile vanished. The door opened. Emma Hartford walked in, followed by 5 other women: the baker's widow, the doctor's wife, the schoolteacher. They stood behind Sarah, a silent wall of solidarity. Emma spoke. "We're witnesses. The debt's paid. Sarah Coulter is free. And if she's not..." She let the threat hang. Brennan looked around the room, calculating. He was a businessman before anything else. Losing face was one thing. Losing customers, the wives who controlled their husbands' purse strings, was another. Finally, he laughed, but it was forced. "Fine. Kane, put your money on the table." Jacob did. $300 in gold coin. Brennan took it, counted it slowly. Then he looked at Sarah with something almost like respect. "You got spine, I'll give you that. Don't come back here." "Wasn't planning on it." Outside, Sarah exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. Jacob touched her elbow gently. "You all right?" "I am now." Emma caught up with them at the edge of town, pulling Sarah into a fierce hug. "You take care of yourself, you hear? And him too." She glanced at Jacob. "He's one of the good ones. Rare as hen's teeth." "I know," Sarah said softly. "I know." They rode back to the cabin in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not empty, but full. When they finally crested the last ridge and saw the cabin below, smoke curling from the chimney where they'd banked the fire that morning, Sarah reined in her horse. "Jacob," she said, "I'm paid up. 1 year. The debt's settled." He stopped, turned to look at her. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the fear in his eyes, the bracing for loss. She smiled. So I guess the question is, can I stay anyway? The relief that broke across his face was like sunrise. He didn't answer with words, just dismounted, walked over and lifted her down from her horse, his hands gentle and sure on her waist. When her feet touched the ground, he kissed her, slow, deep, claiming. "Stay," he said against her mouth. "Stay as long as you want. Forever, if you want." Forever sounds about right. 3 years later, Emma Hartford would write to her sister back east. "You ask about Sarah Coulter. Sarah Kane now, I should say. She and Jacob married in the spring of '77. Quiet ceremony up at their cabin. No children yet, but I don't think that weighs on them. They've made a life that suits them. He hunts and trades. She tends a small garden and teaches reading to the miners' children who find their way up the mountain. They say the cabin's become a way station of sorts for people passing through, especially women with nowhere else to go. Jacob built an addition last year to house them. I visited last month. They seem content. That's the word. Not the wild, desperate happiness of young lovers, but something deeper, something earned. Jacob still doesn't talk much, but when he looks at Sarah, you can see everything he doesn't say. And Sarah, she's become someone I barely recognize. Strong, certain, free. Deadwood's still wild. Brennan's still rich. The world doesn't change much, I suppose. But sometimes one life changes, and maybe that's enough. Sarah and Jacob sitting on the cabin's front porch as the sun sets over the black hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Her head rests on his shoulder. His arm is around her waist. Neither speaks. They don't need to. In Deadwood, $300 bought a woman's freedom. But here, 15 miles into the mountains, two wounded souls bought each other something more precious. A second chance, a home, and the quiet dignity of choosing your own fate. Some stories end with a bang. Gunfights and glory and last stands. This one ends with two people watching the sunset, their hands intertwined, their scars hidden beneath clothes that smell like pine smoke and mountain air. And maybe that's the most romantic ending of all. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me where you're watching from. Stick around. There are more tales from the frontier where broken people found their way home. Until next time, partner.